A lot of people are getting demoted or getting promoted or remaining stagnant because of perception. A year into that, I actually got promoted like 2 levels up. I became privy also to some of the discussions that go on around the table with leadership.
Right.
There was one guy, names are going around, and then his name came up, and our boss pretty much said, actually, I've never heard him talk, man. In the meetings that we have, he's just quiet. I don't know.
Yeah.
That's how he actually did not get that promotion. It was not his technical skills. Coming from Zimbabwe, I think community is a big deal. Bigger shock was, again, family and just how people do life, the privacy, people minding their own business to where they actually do mind their own business. and you're coming from Zimbabwe where everybody knows everybody's business. So now coming to the States, the work ethic that I built in Zimbabwe, it prepared me so well that I just couldn't understand that you are in a university and you're still expecting your professor or your lecturer to give you everything,
Meaningful carriers now. Take the time to take your destiny in your hands now. With meaningful carriers.
Welcome to your hub of information, insights, and inspiration for all things careers. My name is Pardon Pagua, and I'm so thrilled to have our first guest on the channel. His name is Dr. Comfort Manyame. He is one of Zimbabwe's finest exports to the USA. He is a geospatial scientist, a GIS professional, and currently a director of geospatial R&D at a top engineering firm in the USA. He's worked across agriculture, energy, research, strategy, and technology leadership. He holds a PhD from a top university in Texas in the USA. In this first episode, we talk about his early career journey in Zimbabwe and this transition to the USA and some of the key and exciting projects that he has been involved in. So I hope you enjoy, you get informed, you get inspired, you get insights as far as careers are concerned. Thank you, Doc, for joining us. Really appreciate you taking your time to be with us here.
Thanks for having me. This is going to be fun, and I'm excited about just having a chat with you, and hopefully, what we say today can help 1 or 2 people out there that are, still growing in their career.
Oh, I honestly appreciate. So one of the things, just for your info, whenever I listen to any interview or any podcast, the first question I ask myself is, why should I listen to this person? So when I'm talking to you, I'm like, I know why I should be listening to you. You were a student at some point in a foreign land, and you moved all through the ranks as well, from junior level all the way to being a senior leader. So I think there is something in it, whether you're a student or whether you're a migrant employee, or whether you're even a business person, there is something in it for you. So I'm all ears, and I'm looking forward to learning from you. So let's start with just at the beginning, your journey.
So my journey starts in Zimbabwe. At that point, it was still Southern Rhodesia. When I think about it, it makes me realize how old I am. So I was born in Zimbabwe. Or Rhodesia, then at Harare Hospital. Grew up in Chitungwiza, grew up in Gweru. So, I had part of my childhood in Chitungwiza and then part of my childhood in Gweru as well, and then Harare in between there. And then from there, I did my primary education, again in schools in Chitungwiza and Gweru. And then after that, went for my secondary education. I was at a boarding school, Sandringham High School in Norton. So I did my Form 1 to Form 4. And then from there, I went to Ellis Robbins Boys High in Harare. That's where I did my lower 6 and my upper 6. And then, from there, went to the University of Zimbabwe. And then the journey really, I think that's the main part of the journey, because from the University of Zimbabwe, then came to the US for my graduate studies.
Amazing. Sounds like a very long journey through different backgrounds and different environments, isn't it? So in terms of, I'm curious now, having moved from all those different areas, what sort of sparked your interest in technology, in science and tech, I would say?
So what sparked my interest in science and tech really is there's no big backstory to it. It really started at Sandringham High School. So at Sandringham High School, as a border, you have students that are ahead of you, streams ahead of you. Every time, at the end of the year or at the beginning of the year, results for your ordinary level, results for advanced level would be announced in the school hall. And they'll tell you who got what, and then from there you would actually know that some of these guys that were were doing their lower six and upper six were planning to go to university, right? And then there, some of them were planning just to be, to be doctors, some of them to be just scientists, to be lawyers, to be whatever it is they were choosing. So I think for me, that's where that interest in science was sparked, because a lot of the guys that I played with were aiming, to get into the science field and either become doctors or whatever the case may be, right? And also, so that's part of it, which I could call peer pressure, right? Part of it was just the, what your friends were interested in doing, but also a bigger part of it had to do with realizing or recognizing the subjects where I had the most strength. So naturally what would happen is if you were strong in math or physics or biology, then you start gravitating towards sciences for advanced level. And then the natural route for you then would be things like, medicine, agriculture, biology, or, whatever. So that was the other part of it. I think I realized early on that, I was strong. I was an all-rounder. I think I was also okay in my arts, but I had more interest in the sciences. So that's where it really got sparked in high school at Sandringham High School. And then after that, when I went for my advanced level, I picked science subjects. So I was doing biology and chemistry and math, and then of course that spurred me on to take science at the university level.
That's great. So I think what I've just picked from there is there's an element of influence from your peers and everybody around you. There is an element of interest, isn't it, in terms of what you were interested in. And then there's obviously what you were good at in terms of what were your strengths as an individual. Wow, that's amazing. Then let's get into now the detail of somebody might be listening and be like, okay, what science and tech are we talking about here? So I think we just want for you to walk us through really in a brief what GIS is for somebody who might be listening for the first time and trying to figure out how and what this is all about.
So GIS, stands for Geographic Information Systems. So, from that acronym itself, when you say geographic already, you should be thinking location, right? The science of where is stuff. So that's the geographic component. And then the information system part is signifies the fact that you're not just talking about maps, but you're actually talking about a system that includes both software, hardware, and people, right? So GIS in a nutshell is, think about how we used to do maps a long time ago, where it was just a paper map with some representation, lines, maybe some areas, maybe some points or some dots, but really no underlying information that you could interrogate or that you could query, because it's just a paper map. GIS, at a basic level, took that to the next level, where now, instead of it being just a paper record, you can actually interrogate that map. So for example, if it's on a screen, you can click on a line, you click on that road, it tells you what the name of the road is. It may even tell you when that road was built. It may even tell you when was the last time maintenance was done on that road, right? It may even tell you things like what's the width, what's the surface on that road. So now you're adding not just data, but you're also adding intelligence, to that map. So in a nutshell, that's what GIS is, although it expands, right? It's broader than just the digital representation of location. And how I got interested, or how I started working in GIS, is when I went to university in my final year, right? So when I in my senior year at university, we had to do a project. And the project that I did included some GIS work, and I didn't know what GIS was really. So I worked for this soil survey company, and they were using GIS to create maps. That was my first exposure to GIS, and I just got fascinated by it. And from there, that's what really sparked the interest in GIS. And then I've never looked back.
What I'm trying now to connect is, I know you understood you wanted science and tech as early as high school. But then GIS was now at the point when you were starting to do something at university level, isn't it? In terms of when you properly started to understand. Is there anything for somebody that's starting out their career now, in terms of saying, okay, there is the broader science and tech interest, then there is an opportunity to then zero into a particular field? Is there a particular stage at which you say, or it's something that would happen naturally as you progress through university and stuff?
So I think it's both things, right? One, it's a natural progression, but I also
Yeah.
think it has to do with interest in the technology trends. Because when I started getting into GIS, we're talking in the late 90s. Again, to
Yeah.
give
Yeah.
you
Yeah.
context. So we're
Yeah.
talking in the late 90s, early GIS systems, right? So think of what we are doing with AI. Although AI now is a little bit, it's actually kind of a little bit old. But think about the
Mm-hmm.
impact and the interest and the excitement around AI. I think
Mm-hmm.
GIS was that thing also in terms of just geography and mapping. So how it started
Mm-hmm.
for me is, like I said, I was at a soil survey consultancy firm. My
Yes.
degree at the University of Zimbabwe was soil science. So I was doing a bachelor's degree in soil science, and
Mm-hmm.
GIS was the new way of creating
Right.
maps, right? It was the new way, and the
Mm-hmm.
smart way and the efficient way and the more accurate way of creating digital maps. So really, that's
Mm-hmm.
so for me it was the interest of, hey man, this is new technology, this is brand
Yes.
new and not many people are doing it. I really want to be at the forefront of this new thing
Mm-hmm.
called GIS. So that was part of it. But the second part, like you said, is that it was actually like a natural progression, because this is where environmental science, this is
Mm-hmm.
where soil science was going, where GIS was becoming, the fundamental key that you needed for you to be able to produce output that people can view and use. So it
Yeah.
was a natural progression because that's where the science was going, but also it had to do with me having interest in learning, new technology, because I had a feeling this would be big, right? A few years from now,
Yes.
GIS is going to be big. So let me get in.
Mm-hmm.
So that's pretty much how it started for me.
Great. Yeah. So I think my takeaway there is the curiosity element as far as opening new
Hmm.
opportunities is concerned, because anyone out there can study
Yeah,
any degree today, but it may not be what it is whenever they finish it, isn't it? So what then leads that progression is
absolutely.
that curiosity to help them develop in their career. Okay. So let's talk
Yeah.
about, oh, Jenny. I know we've spoken much about Zimbabwe and when you were doing a bit of some research and stuff. Moving to the US,
Mhm.
tell us about that. What influenced your decision to then say, I want to move to the US?
So what influenced my decision is one. I've always felt that I'm an educator. So I've
Mm-hmm.
always felt that I can speak. One thing that I'm not afraid of doing is talk
Yeah.
in
Yes.
front of people, right?
Mm-hmm.
So
Mm-hmm.
I'm not afraid of that. And naturally, like I said, I've always felt that my purpose in life, and what I'm, if you're a Christian, what I would say God has called me to do is really to be an educator, which means I feel
Mm-hmm.
so comfortable teaching, I feel so
Yeah.
comfortable sharing information. So that was the big thing for me. So how or why I ended up or coming to the US became the next natural thing for me to do was because when I was doing I was finishing up my master's degree at the University of Zimbabwe. At that time,
Mm-hmm.
I was already teaching GIS and remote sensing. So I started the GIS and remote sensing program at Bindura University of Science Education. So I was
Wow.
already teaching at Bindura University, GIS and remote sensing, and at the same time, the University of Zimbabwe, where I was finishing my master's, they had already created a position for me, or they were in the process of creating a position for me to teach. So I wanted
Yeah.
to, I'd always wanted to be a professor, teach students and be part of that process of educating. So getting a
Mm-hmm.
PhD was the one thing that I really felt like, hey, if I have a PhD, then it really puts me in a good position to be able to teach, as a professor or as a lecturer. So that was the main driver. But the other driver as well, which of course is more important, is the fact that an opportunity, arose. And that opportunity was to do, again, a PhD in what they call soil physics or hydrology. And I took that opportunity, and maybe one of the things that I can say to prospective students, or
Mm-hmm.
somebody who wants to pursue higher education, is that never disqualify yourself or never limit yourself. Because my story, I mean, it's
Yes.
a long story. I'll share it another day. But what I basically did is there was an advert or a posting for a PhD scholarship, and they were looking for somebody that already had a master's in soils and was ready to do a PhD. I wasn't done with my master's, but I went ahead and applied anyway. And then one thing led to the other, and then maybe 6-7 months later, I was actually offered the scholarship to do the PhD. So again, two things. One, I had the interest because I wanted to position myself to where I could actually educate properly, right? I've always wanted to educate. Getting a PhD was one way of me being able to be part of that, part of that process, or part of that group of professors or that group of lecturers that are qualified to teach at maybe PhD level or master's level. That was the first thing. The second thing is an opportunity arose that I jumped on and took advantage of. So you may want to do this all you want, but if there's no opportunity for you to do it, it just ends up being a dream, right? But for you to capture that opportunity, you got to be prepared. And sometimes you have to be bold enough to say, you know what, I'm going to apply for something that you may know that you're not maybe 100% qualified, to apply for, but apply anyway. Anyway, take your chances, right? Shoot your shot.
Yeah, absolutely. That's inspiring, I would say. So a lot of things that I can already take away from there. There's an element of faith in terms of not, discounting yourself. But what I also take away more importantly is starting a degree or a study with the end goal in mind. You said you wanted to end up in the educating kind of teaching space, and then everything else you did was to sort of take you there, isn't it? So that's really an important piece for anyone listening on that one. Then in terms of then moving to the US, I appreciate it's totally different in terms of culture. There is a massive shift, I would assume, moving from Africa to the US. What was the biggest sort of cultural, changes that you faced?
The biggest cultural change actually was not even academic, right? I think the biggest change for me was just family, family. And so coming from Zimbabwe, I think community is a big deal,
Yes.
where, and I'm sure things are changing now, with time, but I grew up at a time where your neighbor could discipline you, by the way. If they found you misbehaving on the street, they could actually discipline you. And it was okay, right? And your parents were totally cool with it. Actually, to the point that if they found out that you'd be disciplined by the neighbor for some mischief, they'd probably discipline you again, as a bonus, right? That's kind of how that's how it used to be. That's how it used to be. And so community was a big deal. Extended family was a big deal. So now coming to the States, that concept of community was very different, because here, what we quickly found out was that people really keep to themselves. People love their privacy, and so that was one of the bigger things for us as a family. Because when I moved, I came with my wife and my 3-year-old son at that time, right? So that was probably the bigger shock that we got, to realize that, wow, it looks like you're on your own, right? People mind their own business. People do life privately, and now suddenly it's just you and your family. So that was the first thing. In terms of academic, I think there wasn't much of a well, the difference was, I think I found out quickly that the education system in Zimbabwe, for example, at that time, was so much strong. Remember, Zimbabwe as a former British colony, we inherited the British system of education. I think it prepared me so well for pursuing a PhD study. So what I quickly found out is that the work ethic that I built in Zimbabwe, being a student that would like study and take time to really read and all that stuff, it made it easy for me as I transitioned from the British system of education to the American system of education. It was easy for me to kind of just fit in. So in terms of my own personal experience as a student, I think the British system of education prepared me well to pursue my PhD. The other thing that I found out as well, because as part of my PhD, I had to teach, I think, a couple of classes. One of the things that I found out with the undergraduate students then, I don't know if things have changed now, was that, a lot of the students, the way they would, their approach towards school was pretty much very different from our approach towards school in Zimbabwe, for example. Because I can guarantee you then that most of the students during my time, when they went to university, they really wanted to be there. They struggled to be there. Actually, I went to university at a time where the University of Zimbabwe was the biggest institution, for higher education. And you would have, I don't know, maybe 200,000 students doing their Form 6 across the country, right? Coming out of A level, competing for about 2,000 spots at the University of Zimbabwe. So what that meant is that the students that ended up going to the university were students that were really hungry for it. And they would die, to make sure that they pass and become successful. So the thing that I found out here then was that a lot of the students that I was teaching, some, they kind of appeared like they were just there, right? They were forced to be there, right? Because a lot of times I would say to them, guys, I'm not going to spoon feed you. And some of them were really expecting to be spoon fed. So it caused quite a bit of conflict because I just couldn't understand that you're in a university and you're still expecting your professor or your lecturer to give you everything, but again, different culture, different background. So I think that was, in terms of from the academic standpoint, that's probably one of the things that kind of shocked me when I got here. But of course, as time goes on, you begin to understand and you adapt. So those are the two main things I think that I can talk about. The bigger shock was, again, family and just how people do life, the privacy and people minding their own business to where they actually do mind their own business. and you're coming from Zimbabwe where everybody knows everybody's business, and so it was a big cultural change for us as a family,
Yeah, no, I think I can relate in terms of the community. Being in the UK myself, I think I almost went through kind of a similar transition. But I'm curious to understand, though, how did you then manage it in terms of the community, or that dynamic shift in terms of the community, the family? How did you manage it really as a student in the US?
So what we did was actually quite interesting, because there wasn't that community around us. We actually created our own community. So what we did is we started finding graduate students or immigrant students, basically. So we started looking for students that were at my university, which is Texas A&M University. We started looking for students that came from Africa and that came from India. And so these are guys that, we started small with people that were going to the same churches as we did, right? So we created our own community of immigrant students. And what we would do is every other Saturday, they would come to our house for a meal and just for fellowship. So we pretty much knew what was going on with everybody. so we'd get together, have a meal, and do a Bible study sometimes, and we do like worship. But it really, for the years that a lot of those students were in school, which was maybe 3 years, 4 years, they always had a community. And that community is actually something that we started because we're like, okay, if there's no community, we might as well become the community. And we started it, and we did that. We did that for a very long time, until we moved from Texas, to the Midwest. But that's how we did it. We created our own community.
Wow. That's great. I think that's a good way of looking at it, really, to say do it yourself. They call it DIY in this space, isn't it?
Exactly.
Where you have to do it yourself.
You gotta be the change that you want, right?
Yeah, exactly. So, but one thing I like, though, from an academic perspective, I think you raised an important point that I took away there, is the transferable skill that you had from Zimbabwe that made you sort of thrive in the academic setting in the US. So I think that's a good takeaway point, really, for anyone watching, to say, don't take lightly, the struggles that you're going through in Zimbabwe. You are building sort of a skill set. The scarcity of opportunity might mean you need to take it more seriously, such that when you get a better opportunity, you're able to, outperform and outshine your competition anyway. So I want us to move on to your first major role in the US now, post all the studies, etc. So tell me really about your early professional roles. Maybe before we get to the US, actually, let's take it a bit back in terms of, I know we've covered academics a bit, but you've also touched briefly on some of the roles that you took up. But I just want to see that transition from your junior roles to where you are now.
Yeah. So let me start with Zimbabwe. So in Zimbabwe, actually, it was quite interesting. Whilst I was waiting for my A-level results to be out, I got a job working for a chemist. So a guy who was doing water testing for the city of Harare, So he actually took me on and trained me how to do it. So I was running all those tests, and the funny thing was that the stuff that I was doing there, testing water, some of the analysis I was doing, actually ended up being some of the stuff that I was doing in college as part of my chemistry class. So it was quite interesting that, I was doing something during the holidays as a job, as my first job. And then when I went to university, I was doing exactly, in one of my classes, in the chemistry class, I was doing exactly the same stuff that I was doing when I was working, right? So in Zimbabwe, that was really maybe my first job. And then went to university. When I was finishing up, I started teaching at Bindura University of Science Education, I think University College of Science Education. So I taught there for a semester, did GIS and remote sensing, and then moved to the States. And then when I moved to the States, after I finished my PhD, my first role, my first professional job was as a GIS manager for a power company. And maybe one of the things you briefly touched on skills, right? One of the things that influenced my pursuit of GIS as a profession was the fact that it's industry agnostic, right? So you can use GIS is pretty much everywhere. So you can use GIS in any industry. Why? Because location, right? So that was a very deliberate step on my part to say I'm going to pursue GIS because I know that I'm not restricted to being just a scientist, or I'm not restricted to soil science. I can actually apply GIS in forestry, in environmental science, in whatever the case may be. So GIS, when I finished my PhD, I worked for a power company. Again, this is something that would have been like, what? Because my major was soil physics. So naturally, somebody would have thought, so maybe you get into agriculture, or maybe you get into soil science, or, agronomy or something like that. But I actually worked for a power company doing GIS for them, so they hired me to be their GIS manager. I started GIS there for them, and took it to the next level basically. And then so that was my first major role coming out of college, as a GIS manager. And then I transitioned from that into agri-sciences, so kind of coming back home, worked for a big, agri-sciences company, multinational. Again, they hired me as a GIS lead for their research and development group. That's how I started there. Did that just for a year, and then transitioned into a leadership, more like a strategy, leadership role, which I held for, 6 years or so before I transitioned back to Texas, where now I'm working for an engineering consultancy firm. Again, in a leadership, GIS leadership role.
One question that I have, though, when you reflect on your career, especially in your early days when you were starting your career, what sort of skills were important, or skills that mattered at that level? I'm looking at somebody who has just recently finished their school in terms of graduation, their first degree and so forth. What sort of skills matter at the point of your career?
When you are starting, the technical skills are important, because I think the technical skills are what open the door for you. So whatever you're majoring in. So in my case, right, my major was soil physics, but with a lot of GIS, and I'd already made up my mind early on that I'll probably work in the GIS space, in the geospatial sciences space, not so much in the soil space, but in the GIS space. So what mattered for me was to make sure that I was up to speed in terms of my GIS skills. And then one of the things that I did right after graduating with my PhD is to get certification for GIS. So I was one of the first GIS professionals to get certified. So I did that because, again, I knew that with that certification, it would open doors in the GIS space. And it did exactly that, because like I said, my first role for a power company was really because of my GIS skills. And then my when I transitioned to the agri-sciences company, I also got in there using my GIS skills, although that morphed and transitioned into something else a few years later. But what opened the door for me was the technical skills. So to anybody, like to the younger people that are trying to get into the market, I would say that make sure that you're up to speed with your technical skills. Right now, there's AI is a big thing, and I think those are some of the skills, those are some of the skills that it wouldn't hurt to add to somebody's skill set, not just resume, but actually being able to do it, right? So technical skills for those that are in the technical field, you have to be up to speed with your technical skills, because again, like I said, I think that's what opens the door. In a pool of say maybe 100 candidates, they will obviously be looking to make sure that whoever they end up hiring has got the technical expertise or the technical skills to at least do the job, right? And then once that door is open and you're in, for me, what the transition that happened was I got in with the technical skills, but what made me rise, vertically really was more the soft skills, you know.
Right.
It wasn't much the technical skills, but it's like how you deal with people, your emotional intelligence. Do you fit in the culture? What is the perception that people have of you? People will be surprised that perception plays a very big role when it comes to growing vertically in an organization. What do people think about Pardon, right? Do they think that you're easy to work with, And the sad thing too, because I noticed this when I got into leadership, that there are some guys that we would not promote because the perception around the leadership of the organization was that maybe they're too quiet, maybe they don't contribute, maybe, and all of this is just perception. It may not be backed by hard data, but it's perception. And a lot of people are getting demoted or getting promoted or remaining stagnant because of perception. So I know I've said a million things there. Hopefully you can find your answer in there.
Yes, absolutely. I think what I've gathered really from all this is the hard skills matter because they are sort of your keys to opening the different doors.
Yeah.
The soft skills now determine how far you go. They're like your fuel in terms of how far do you then go. They give you the energy. And in that mix, I also got something around the perception that people have of you. So it's the narrative that you create, how you manage the impression around people that you're working with, isn't it? So definitely, I took a lot from that, and I'm hoping somebody watching also has taken a bit. So the other question then is your transition across the different roles. I know you might have already touched on it when you spoke about the skills and so forth, but the transition to say you started in the energy, agriculture, now the engineering, R&D bit. How did you find the transition? How did it go for you? How did you manage?
So for me, actually, it'll be surprising for me to say this to you. The transitions across industries were easier than the transitions within the same industry. So I'll give you an example.
Wow. Okay.
When I went into agri-sciences, I was hired as a technical leader. And then a year into my role as a technical leader, doing what I really loved doing or what I felt this is my calling, right? A year into that, I actually got promoted like 2 levels up into a leadership role that was not necessarily technical, but it was very strategic. So that transition now from being a technical leader to being, somebody who is helping with formulating strategy, and where your deliverables are not necessarily measured by a piece of code that you have written or a map that you have produced, and now your deliverables are actually measured across different groups that maybe you are working over, or maybe different projects that don't have like they're not done in 2 months or in 3 months, but some of them are multi-year projects. For me, that was actually, to be honest, that was probably harder for me to manage that kind of transition than it was when I moved from the energy industry to agri-sciences and now back to engineering. So the transition between the different industries, to be honest, for me, were a little bit easy. Why? Because I was selling the same product, which is me, So the product never really changed. The product never changed, but it's the packaging that changed. So let's start with the energy industry. I was doing providing leadership in geographic information systems and remote sensing, and then moved to the agri-sciences industry, where initially I was providing leadership in geographic information systems and remote sensing. So same product, right? And then of course I transitioned within that industry, through advancements and promotions. And then when I left, I'm in the engineering space now, where I'm still providing, geospatial leadership with, of course, now not so much on the technical side, I still do technical stuff, every now and then, but most of it is actually just strategic. As in, where do we see ourselves 2 years from now, 3 years from now, 5 years from now, or the things that we're doing well today? Can I shoot holes into those processes and say we could be doing this better? So that's pretty much more the space that I'm operating in now. But again, those transitions between industries were easier just because the product was still the same, but maybe a different packaging. I don't know if that makes sense.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that sort of preempts my next question that I was going to ask, to say, what does it take then for a job seeker out there to kind of pivot, across different industries? I think one takeaway that I got from you is knowing the product, which is you, and then packaging it differently is what then sells at the end of the day. But is there anything else that you wanted to add on that particular point in terms of anyone who wants to pivot?
When I got into GIS, one of the driving forces, of course, was the interest, right? It was exciting. It was a new thing. And I also knew this is where, soil science is going. This is where environmental science is going. Not many people were doing it. I think at that time, actually, when I was at university, that consultancy firm that I did an internship with, I think they probably were the only ones in the country that were doing GIS. I think so, right? So apart from that, I think the other thing is, and I've mentioned it, is the whole idea of realizing that GIS is industry agnostic, meaning I could transfer those skills across different industries. I think that was one of the bigger things that has also made it easy when I can talk about, hey, this is the product packaged differently, but at the bottom of that, or at the the foundation of all that, is the fact that the skills that I went for are industry agnostic, and the skills that I went for can easily be transferred across different industries. So to the young person who's maybe in the job market or not yet in the job market but are getting training, I would actually say look for those skills that can cut across different disciplines, right? So that you're not restricting yourself to just one industry. You can be valuable across different industries. So that's probably the advice that I would say is important, especially for people that are trying to pivot, from one industry to another. Make sure you've got skills that can be, that can map across different disciplines.
I think we have covered mostly about job seekers and entry level. Now I want to address maybe concerns or questions that somebody that is already in a managerial position, or midway in their career, are concerned to say, how do I then move from being kind of management or junior member of staff to that senior director level? I think that's the next question that I want to understand from you, in terms of how did you transition from that technical bit to the leadership role that you are now in?
The technical skills, like I said, they open the door, they put you in the room. But what I found out, I'll give myself as an example. When the promotion that I was talking about, where I was promoted like 2 levels up from where I was, happened because people were talking about me in the room. So leadership was actually talking about me in the room. So this is how it happened, right? A position, one of our leaders left and joined another company, right? So their role or their position was left vacant. And so that role was left vacant, and I think it took us a couple of months or 3 months before we could backfill, before we could fill it. And then I saw the role. I did not even apply. Why? Because it was such a role that you'd need to have been in the company maybe 5 years or 10 years for you to really understand what the heck is going on, right? So I never even applied for it. I saw it, never applied. I was okay where I was, until my boss said to me, "Hey, Comfort, man, do you understand that the leadership people are talking about you a lot, and it's good things, by the way, good things. People are actually talking about you a lot. Have you seen that position for, this role?" And I said, "Yeah, I saw it, but, I kind of felt like it's way up there. And I've been in the organization for less than 12 months, and I just kind of didn't think that it's something that I would apply for, because I think I'm still fresh, And she said to me, "No, I think you have to apply for it, because the leadership has actually been talking about you concerning this role." So I applied for it, and then, of course, I got it, right? And when I got it, that's when I became privy also to some of the discussions that go on around the table with leadership.
Right.
So when I was talking about perception, this played out in front of my eyes, right? So we're trying to promote some folks, to a little bit senior positions. There was one guy who very brilliant, brilliant software developer, and we knew his work. We kind of knew him, and I really thought he had the qualifications for it, right? So names are going around, and then his name came up, and our boss pretty much said, actually, I've never heard him talk, man. In the meetings that we have, he's just quiet. I don't know.
Yeah.
That's how he actually did not get that promotion. It was not his technical skills, but it was the whole idea of I've never heard him talk. So why I'm saying this, it opened my eyes to the idea of you have to be out there marketing your success. One of the things that I've seen with immigrants, and again, I'll speak for myself and maybe for a lot of Zimbabweans and maybe even Africans, right? And I think maybe there's some Asian, cultures that are like that as well, to where, we feel like, hey, my work is going to speak for itself. I don't need to be the one saying, hey, I've done this, I've done that, it actually borders, on being proud. My work should be able to speak for itself. That's the one thing that I think kills opportunities for a lot of immigrants. I learned this by sitting in leadership meetings where presenting your work, talking about your achievements, to the right people, of course, so letting your boss know what you have done, letting your boss know the difference you're making to the bottom line, making your boss know about the help that you have given to the 10 other departments, that are in your circle. All those things matter when it comes to making that transition from being a junior level, management type person to being a leader. Why? Because you're making the work and the results visible, so that's the first thing. Market your success. The second thing is networking is very important.
Yes.
Networking is very important within the organization. Again, be visible, because most of these promotions, when you have 10 people that have the same skill set, what makes the difference? What differentiates you? That's where the soft skills now start coming into play. Are you okay, or are you right for the culture? Are you good with teamwork? Can you work with other people? Are you empathetic? It's surprising, seriously, because I think a lot of younger professionals don't think of it like this. They just think that, hey, the skills that I have, how much code I can write, how much software I can develop, those things matter. But when it comes to moving vertically within an organization, most of it has to do with, do you fit in the culture? What are your soft skills like? How do you communicate? Do we know what you have done in terms of the successes? What's the success story, right? Are you taking credit for everything, or you're giving credit to other people? Are you the guy that will say, hey, my team has done A, B, C, D. Hey, Pardon has actually done A, B, even though they were doing it under your leadership? Are you the guy that gives credit to other people? All those things matter when it comes to moving vertically within an organization. So I hope that helps.
That really helps. I think the takeaway for me is visibility is key. Networking is key. It's not all about saying I'm doing all the hard work. The work will speak for itself. But one thing out of curiosity, you mentioned something about, say, marketing what you've done versus marketing what the team has done. Is there a balance then between saying, I have done this and my team has done this? Is it going to disadvantage me if I take all the credit? Is it going to limit my chances? How does that work then?
You market your success, especially if you're an individual contributor. Because usually individual contributors are the ones where people may not know what you're doing, right? But if you're in charge of a team, my rule of thumb is always market your team, because your leadership knows that this is your team, right?
Right.
So when you're marketing, hey, this is what my team has done, even to the extent of mentioning names. Hey, this is what Joyce did. Hey, this is what Pardon has done. This is what Bethel is working on. She has really knocked it out of the park. This is because they know that it's your team, because that really speaks to your leadership. When you talk about your team, it really does speak more to your leadership, than anything else. And that's what, so if you're in charge of a team, I would say 99% of the times, market your team, because your leaders know that it's your team. And if they are doing good, if they're doing well, then it reflects well on you as their leader. Does that help?
Amazing. That really helps. I think that answers the question perfectly for me, because I think there is that balance. I was just trying to establish really what's the best way. So my takeaway is if you are leading a team, then talk about the team if you want to get into that
Yes.
leadership space. But if it's all about you and trying to move to the next level and you're not leading a team, then obviously speak well of what you have delivered as an individual. So, that really makes sense.
Exactly.
I think we've talked about your transition quite a lot now in terms of the journey. I just want to get to what you have delivered or what you have been involved in as an individual. It's funny that we're just talking about let your work speak for itself, or you should market your work and stuff. Let's test this now.
Yeah.
in this next segment, if you don't mind.
So no, that's a good question, and it's one that I'm prepared to answer, right? So for me, testament of work that I did that I'm really proud of is something that I realized 10 years later. So here's I'll just give you an example of some stuff that we did. So when I was still working in the power industry, in the energy industry, right, as the GIS and research guy and all that stuff, we pioneered a work, right, using, we were flying drones, capturing LiDAR, which is basically just a technology that uses laser pulses, to figure out, heights, and identifying, 3D models and things like that. So we're using LiDAR to figure out where utilities or power companies need to clear vegetation close to their power lines, right? So we started doing that. Nobody was really doing it, at least for our space. So I can safely say we were the first ones to really do it, right? So we did this work. I came up with a plan for my former company of what they need to do in terms of clearing their vegetation, right? To say, across your circuits where you're supplying power, this circuit, you need to clear it this year or next year because of maybe the growth patterns around those power, those power lines. So I came up with this comprehensive plan of how they needed to manage what we call the right of way. So this is 2014, 2015, thereabouts. We came up with that plan, implemented it, and the company started using it. So fast forward, I left that company, 2018, and then went to work for that agri-sciences company. Came back 6 years later, but then didn't join that company, joined a consultancy firm. And apparently my old company is one of our clients, right? So what really thrilled me was the fact that that plan that I had come up with more than 10 years ago is the plan that they're still using, more than 10 years later, and it is still as effective as it was when I created it in 2014, 2015. So when I look back, I was just like, oh my God, this plan that I came up with way back then with very limited data, by the way. So I had very limited data, ran some analytics, came up with their plan. Now, of course, we've got more data, better data, smarter processes, but we ended up in the same place that I was 2014, 2015. So when I look at that, it's really kind of, I think it's one of those that make me proud to realize that, I did this work. It's still as effective more than 10 years later as it was when I created it. And with new methods, new technology, it's still saying this is the best you could have done then, and it's still the best you can do today in terms of the results.
Wow. That's amazing. I think, is it fair then for me to then conclude to say how you felt that this work was truly meaningful, or this project was truly meaningful, was that it was future proof as well? It's still relevant in the future. It's not just a once-off thing.
Absolutely. That's the right assessment. And also that work forms the basis. It actually does form the basis of a product that my company now we are providing. It's a solution that we're providing to other power companies across the nation. It's actually based on some of those findings and some of that work. So we've pretty much just expanded it and made it better, and so, but the basis for all that is work that we did more than 10 years ago, so yes, it is. I mean, you're right to say we managed to do something that was future proof, right? Something that even 10, 15 years later, regardless of the changes in technology and the advancements in technology, it is still relevant, so yeah.
Wonderful. Then let's move on. I'm conscious of our time as well, but I'm learning, and I'm hoping our viewers are learning as well. And I want us to talk briefly about drones and data. So you worked on UAVs and NDVI to detect dead trees near power lines. I'll be honest, I have no idea what this is. So I'll be looking towards you to kind of explain what it is. But I think the question for me, yes,
Yeah.
it's fascinating in terms of these acronyms and stuff. But for a young person watching, what does this tell us really about the future of technology in terms of careers as well?
Science and technology can actually have real life impact, so it translates to the real world. So, for example, when we're talking about NDVI is an index. NDVI stands for Normalized Difference Vegetation Index. And what it is basically is an index that we use as a proxy for biomass, or it tells us about vegetation health. How that works is we use satellite imagery, or we use imagery that's been captured in what we call 4 bands, the RGB, which is what you can see with your eyes: red, green, blue. And then we also need like an infrared or a near infrared band that your eyes cannot see, but it tells us something very important about how plants or how vegetation responds, right? So how it works basically is your healthy vegetation absorbs, that near infrared light, and then your dying or stressed vegetation absorbs it, but your healthy vegetation reflects it. So basically, we use that property to figure out, whether vegetation is healthy or whether it's unhealthy or is dead. So what we did is we were using drones or UAVs, right, unmanned aerial vehicles. We're using drones. We would slap a camera on the drone, and then that camera will be taking photos of vegetation in those 4 bands: the red, the green, the blue, which is what optical, which is what your eyes can see, and near infrared, which you cannot see but it can be sensed. And then we use that now to figure out where those dead trees are or where trees that are dying are. And why that was important is, again, for the power industry, like I said, they have to maintain corridors around their power lines, and those corridors need to be clear of vegetation. But what normally happens is that trees that are growing outside of that corridor, usually, if they die, for example, then they can fall on power lines. And if they fall on power lines, then of course you have a power outage, or worst case scenario, you can start a fire, right? So these power companies are trying as much as they can to proactively, identify those trees that are either unhealthy or that are already dead, to make sure that they take them out of the system before they cause damage to their power lines. So basically, that's what the whole NDVI space is. And then NDVI also it allows you to see the stress that the tree is going under, which you cannot see with your naked eye. So if you send somebody out there to say, hey, check for me to see what trees are being stressed, most of the times they may not be able to identify because maybe the stress has just started. But NDVI gives you like a scientific way to say, hey, the values that I'm finding, the NDVI values that I have for this tree indicate that there's some stress going on, and then once you know that, then you can send your folks to go and check what is going on. So in a nutshell, this is real science with real impact in the real world, basically. So it's not like a recreation science where we're just doing it for fun, but we're actually doing this to identify hazards that can cause either wildfires or that can cause damage to the system if they fall and break the lines, or, trees that can cause power outages across our systems.
I think this is one of those practical examples that everybody can relate in terms of science and technology really impacting the daily livelihood and the daily aspects that people need in their lives, isn't it? So thank you for that clarification. Then I think the last question for this episode, and I'm hoping you are still going to be available for us to walk through the remaining questions, because I've got loads of them for our audience. So in terms of just the...
I'm here.
Thank you so much. Really appreciate it. Then in terms of digital agriculture, then what role is geospatial technology playing in the future of food security and sustainability? And are there any opportunities in Africa from your perspective, just to take it back home then?
So digital agriculture, technology, geospatial, again, everything is location, right? So where you plant your crop, it's got an X, Y, and Z component, right? You know the location, you know the depth, you know all that stuff. So even the plants that we grow have an X, Y, Z component. So with geospatial, one of the things that we're doing in my previous role, in my previous job, is we had started looking at knowing where exactly to plant a seed based on the soil properties, based on fertility, based on slope, so you'd say you're placing your seed at exact locations where you give that seed the best chance of providing a yield. So that's the first thing, right? Knowing where to place seed is a very geospatial science based exercise. So that's the first thing. The second thing is we would actually also be able to map your field to see the fertility of that field, right? So map your field to show which areas of the field are highly fertile, which ones are not. And then by doing that, you can actually already predict what your yield is going to be, right? So now you're not assuming that you're going to get the same yield across the whole field. You actually know that this spot is going to give me higher yields, this spot is going to give me low yield. That helps you in planning. So yield estimations we can do using GIS, things like even weeding, right? So I saw whilst in my old life, they were using weeders, or actually not even weeders, but thinners. You know how you can thin your plants. So you have cameras on this equipment that would count the number of plants. And then if you know what the plant population needs to be, it would actually be removing the extra plants. So that's, so all that's technology, right? That's technology. So in planting, in weeding, in, transplanting, in estimating your yields, one thing that actually a team that, my team was working on in my old company is something called, I think it was yield photometry, where you basically would take a picture of a corn, a cob, and then it could count the number of kernels. And then by doing that, you can actually estimate the yield of the whole field, basically. So again, these are yield estimations that you could do just by taking a picture using your cell phone, and then it scales and estimates across the whole field. So now your question is, how does that impact food security? So when you look at the food security situation, with a population approaching 10, 11 billion, right? The land that we have is not expanding. What that means is that we actually need to be able to produce more on that small, area that we have, right? Estimates, I think we actually need to make more than 70% more production for us to be able to keep up with the population. But how do you increase that production if the land you have is not expanding? Now, this is where something we call precision agriculture becomes important. It means you are applying the right kind of input, the right amount of input in the right place on your field, right? You're not just doing these blanket recommendations for the whole field. You are doing it based on what is the fertility, what is the soil type, all that stuff is being done in a precise way, right? So you save on inputs, you save on, inputs like fertilizers or chemicals, but you're also saving on seed, because now you're not just putting your seed everywhere, even in places where it will not even germinate, right? So the whole idea now behind digital agriculture or precision agriculture and food security is trying to improve our yields using the same amount of land that we have. And we really believe that digital ag is that next frontier, or is that next thing that allows us to do that. Now, the question is, how relevant or how applicable is this in Africa? That's an interesting question, right? Because Africa, as you know, different cultures, different capabilities in terms of infrastructure. Because digital ag, for the most part, really relies on you being connected, right? So if you're connected to the internet, you can start getting information like advisory. You could be getting one of the things that we started doing, and I think when I was still, again, in my old life, we're doing this in South Africa, where a farmer, for example, could get in his field. If they're having problems with maybe a disease on their plant, they could take a picture of that leaf, of a leaf or whatever the case may be. And then immediately they could get feedback to say, hey, by the way, this is this disease. This is how you take care of it. But for you to be able to do that, obviously, you need to be connected. So that infrastructure of connectivity is one of the limitations that there are. But in countries where connectivity is not an issue anymore, opportunities for digital ag do exist, right? Where you can be doing things in the cloud, you can be getting advice in the cloud. The stuff with GPS, for example, being able to do precise locations or precise placement of seed, that relies on being connected, But again, I also know that a lot of countries in Africa now are at that point in their development where connectivity is becoming more and more widespread. So imagine talking to somebody in the village on WhatsApp, for example, right? Or somebody in the village being on Facebook, because connectivity is getting better. So I really think that five or 10 years ago, one of the biggest limitations to digital ag in developing economies was the whole idea that, yeah, but you need internet, or you need to be connected, or you need a cell phone.
Yeah.
I think that is slowly becoming a non-issue, right? Because as advancements takes place, we are having more and more connectivity, even in the most rural of rural Africa, basically. So there is an opportunity. Maybe the short answer to this is there is an opportunity, and we are getting more and more connected. You know, we're having more and more areas, even remote areas, being online. So now they can suddenly use their cell phones to receive agronomic, advisory. You know, being able to be in touch with an agronomist on the phone to tell them what they need to do in the event that maybe there's a disease or there's some pests or whatever the case may be. You know, that is slowly becoming a reality for most African economies.
Wow. It doesn't get any more practical than this. It's so real and it's so applicable, and it affects the food that we ultimately want to get, isn't it? So I think I totally got this, and I got really the importance of the infrastructure, the connectivity, and using the technology and precision agriculture. That's a good term that I took away from this last point, really. And talking about precision, I think, looking at our time as well, I think we may want to stop at this point. Then maybe when we speak next, we then get into some of the challenges and some of the real talk, really, to just share with us some of your lessons, any key takeaways, any key nuggets that you want to share with our audience. But I think for today, really, thank you so much, because I think if somebody is a job seeker or a student, definitely there must be something that they've taken away from this in terms of looking at your journey, how you ended up, settling for the science and tech space. If somebody is looking for a job or looking to get promoted and move upwards in their career, I think we have touched a lot about that. Then in terms of business and opportunities, particularly even for Africa, this whole technology presents a massive opportunity for anyone who wants to get into that business space. So I think we've got something for everybody in this episode. So thank you so much, Doc. Really appreciate, and I hope we'll speak in the next episode. And for our viewers, please like, share, subscribe, comment. If you've got any questions for Doc, please throw them in the comments as well. Then we can always address them in the future. Thank you for now.
Thanks for having me.
Meaningful carriers now. Take the time to take your destiny in your hands now.